Lesson 3.7, Market Regulation in Canada, will deal in general with how securities are regulated in Canada and some of the bodies that are included in this regulation. This will not be an exhaustive discussion of market regulation, but will provide just a bare framework of the regulatory environment in Canada. In Canada, the regulation of securities is said to be the domain of the provinces, which means that each province is responsible to regulate and set legislation for securities dealing in their province. In New Brunswick, we have FCNB, which stands for the Financial and Consumer Services Division for New Brunswick. Within that organization, we have the New Brunswick Securities Commission. Some provinces have a commission, some provinces have an administrator, but the role of the regulatory body is the same in each province. They're responsible to set the rules and regulations to ensure that investors are protected in the province. That doesn't mean that an investor in one province gets an entirely different experience than an investor in another province, because we do also have a body called the CSA, the Canadian Securities Administrators, and that body is made up of one representative from each of the provincial bodies, and they work together to ensure that all of the regulatory frameworks across the country are harmonized so that the experience for a person in New Brunswick is very similar to the experience for someone in Ontario or Saskatchewan. Doesn't mean there can't be small differences, but by and large, regulations and legislation are harmonized by the CSA. In addition to those provincial rules and regulations, we also have some national bodies who are involved in overseeing the conduct of the people that work within the industry. So these bodies are called SROs, or self-regulatory organizations. And in Canada, that includes two bodies, the MFDA and IIROC. So I'm just going to take a minute to talk about who those bodies are and specifically what they do. So way back when, there was something called the Investment Dealers Association, the IDA, and it was the only SRO that oversaw, I should say, the conduct of the people selling securities in each province in Canada. But the IDA did not include those institutions that only sold mutual funds. So there was concern that the people selling mutual funds were not subject to the same regulations. So the MFDA came into being to make sure that the people who sell mutual funds have the same type of oversight as the people who sell other securities. At the same time, when the MFDA came into being, or just shortly after, the IDA was sort of split up a little bit, and we then had the body called IIROC, the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada, take its place. So now, as SROs in Canada, we have IIROC and the MFDA. Anyone who sells securities in Canada belongs to an institution or works for an institution that is a member of one of these two bodies. So basically everyone that was a part of the IDA before became part of IIROC. That would include all of the securities dealers, your big investment houses, Nesbitt Burns, CIBC, Wood Gundy, etc. So they all continued on in the same frame and are now part of IIROC. And anyone who was not part of the old IDA became part of the MFDA. So if an institution only deals with mutual funds, then they will be a member of the MFDA, and their employees will be overseen by the MFDA with regard to their conduct. Someone who is employed by a member of IIROC has their conduct reviewed by IIROC. So anybody working in the industry in Canada is subject to oversight. It's just a matter of which body is overseeing their conduct. So the SROs are responsible to look at how those dealing with the public are dealing with the public and making sure that the public is protected. And the provincial legislation deals not as much with conduct, although sometimes it does. It deals more with the securities themselves.
Any legislation that we have in this country, in Canada, with regard to securities deals with three main issues. I'll list all three of them, and then I'll go into each one into a little bit of detail. The three main issues are disclosure, registration, and enforcement. Disclosure relates to the disclosure of all of the information to the investing public that they need to know. So this is dealt with within the prospectus for any new securities. All information on the new securities and the company issuing them is included in the prospectus. We also deal with it with investment advisors. When they're registered, they must disclose to clients any conflict of interest that there may be within their dealings. Registration is one of the methods through which we deal with disclosure and enforcement. All securities must be registered for sale. All companies that are selling securities must be registered to do so, and all individuals working for those companies must be registered in order to show that they have met the appropriate requirements in order to be able to sell those securities. So registration is in place to ensure that those people who are dealing with the public have exhibited a level of competence in that regard. Finally, we have enforcement, and in order to ensure the existence of a fair market, the legislation that we have in place is designed to enforce these registration and disclosure rules. So if people that are involved in the issuance or the sale of securities to the investing public do not pay attention to the rules and regulations in place, then there are methods by which they can be dealt with, whether it is the removal of their registration, suspension, fines that can be imposed, and sometimes resulting in criminal charges.
One of the organizations that's been brought into place to further protect investors is the Canadian Investor Protection Fund, or CIPF. The Canadian Investor Protection Fund has been put in place, I say at the beginning of the slide here, to protect clients of sponsoring SROs from the failure of that member, which would be bankruptcy or insolvency. So, and below that, I've said IIROC. So for the Canadian Investor Protection Fund, they are protecting investors who have invested with any member of IIROC. So if we remember, IIROC has as its members all of those institutions that are selling securities, not just simply mutual funds. So let's say we're using ScotiaMcLeod as an example. If Bob is a client of ScotiaMcLeod's, ScotiaMcLeod is a member of IIROC, and as a result of being a member of IIROC, they have bankruptcy and insolvency protection for their clients under CIPF, which means that if ScotiaMcLeod suffers financial difficulty and becomes insolvent or goes bankrupt, Bob's investments will be protected from that. So this is not to be confused with protecting Bob's investment value from loss due to market drops or due to the things that he's invested in decreasing in value. It's not that. It's protecting Bob from the bankruptcy of his investment broker or dealer. So his amount of protection would be limited to $1 million, but there are two different types of accounts that CIPF covers for a maximum of $1 million per institution. So $1 million in a general account, which includes most of your investment accounts, and then there's another separate account for things like registered investments or partnerships or accounts for minors and things like that. We'll learn more about that in further discussions in other classes, but for this point I want you to know what CIPF stands for and what it is that they're protecting investors against, and specifically that the SRO that sponsors CIPF is IIROC. Much like the protection that CIPF offers to investors who invest with IIROC members, the MFDA Investor Protection Corporation, or MFDA IPC, gives the same type of protection to clients of members of the MFDA. So let's use Investors Group as an example. If Investors Group is a member of the MFDA and Susan is investing with Investors Group, then she would have MFDA IPC protection against Investors Group going insolvent or bankrupt. So it acts just like the CIPF protection. It's just that instead of covering the clients of IIROC members, MFDA IPC covers the clients of MFDA members. Same rules go with regard to the amount of protection, the $1 million per client in each general and separate account with the member. And again, we'll go into more detail later on what those are.
Our discussion of securities regulation wouldn't be complete if we didn't discuss insider trading to some degree. Essentially what insider trading is the use of non-public information or information that is not available to the general public to make a profit. It is illegal to do so, and there are rules and regulations in place to ensure that those people who are in a position to receive non-public or inside information cannot use it for their own benefit. And the reason that this is so important in the securities industry is because investors would not continue to invest if they did not feel that it was a level playing field. If I knew that every time new information came to light about a company, the people that work within that company could make use of the information before I became aware of it, then I wouldn't want to buy stock in that company because I would never feel that I would get a fair shake. So these rules are in place to protect the general investing public from that happening. And one of the rules that is in place is that insiders must report their trading activity when they trade in the shares of the company for which they are an insider. This means that any of the trades that are made by these insiders are watched carefully by the securities commissions to ensure that insider trading has not been engaged in. Another process that I'd like to introduce you to with regard to securities regulation is the arbitration process. Basically, this facility has been set up in the event that there is a dispute between a client and their investment dealer. If I feel that my investment dealer has not dealt fairly with me, and I feel that I have experienced damage as a result of it, then I can pursue arbitration in that matter if I have gone to my brokerage firm and I've tried to speak to them about it and I don't feel that I have received the amount of consideration that I should have. Then I can take it to arbitration. The maximum amount that I can take is for a claim of up to $100,000. And if I go to arbitration, I have to agree that after the decision is made, the decision is binding and I cannot sue the company after the fact.